to give up generous tribute. I'm most grateful. Writing in 1946-7, Ludwig Wittgenstein made some observations on conceptions of neural representations and correlations between thought processes and brain processes that presage 21st century debates. They are highly controversial. They have occasioned multiple conflicting interpretations and misunderstandings. Although written more than 75 years ago, they retain their freshness and forcefulness. If correct, they undermine some of the deepest preconceptions of contemporary cognitive neuroscience and neurology, as well as experimental psychology. Wittgenstein wrote as follows, and the quotations come from Zettel 608 following. No supposition seems to be more natural than that there is no process in the brain correlated with associating or with thinking, so that it would be impossible to read off thought processes from brain processes. I mean this. If I talk or write, there is, I assume, a system of impulses going out from my brain and correlated with my spoken or written thoughts. But why should the system continue further in the direction of the center? Why should this order not proceed, so to speak, out of chaos? The case would be like the following. Certain kinds of plants multiply by seed, so that a seed always produces a plant of the same kind as that from which it was produced. But nothing in the seed corresponds to the plant which comes from it, so that it is impossible to infer the properties or structure of the plant from those of the seed that comes out of it. This can only be done from the history of the seed. So an organism might come into being even out of something quite amorphous, as it were, causelessly. And there is no reason why this should not really hold for our thoughts, and hence for our talking and writing. It is therefore perfectly possible that certain psychological phenomena cannot be investigated physiologically, because physiologically nothing corresponds to them. I saw this man years ago. Now I see him again, recognize him, remember his name. And why does there have to be a cause of this remembering in my nervous system? Why must something or other, whatever it may be stored up there in any form? Why must a trace have been left behind? Why should there not be a psychological regularity to which no physiological regularity corresponds? If this upsets our concepts of causality, then it's high time they were upset. Unquote. These passages may well seem shocking. Anthony Kenny, one of the foremost Wittgenstein scholars of his day and a Wittgensteinian philosopher of psychology, found himself unable to follow in Wittgenstein's footsteps. He wrote as follows: since the time of Galileo, it has been a presumption of science that every power has a vehicle, that to every potentiality for the future there corresponds a present actuality. It is this presumption that Wittgenstein is here calling into question. He is undoubtedly correct that there's nothing conceptually incoherent in the idea of a capacity existing without a material vehicle. But one must ask whether, and if so when, it can be reasonable for science simply to give up the quest for a vehicle. I share the queasiness about this passage that is widespread even among Wittgenstein's admirers. Much of history suggests that scientific progress is made by inquiring into the vehicles of capacities, rather than by treating capacities, such as normative powers, as the basic building blocks of science. Maybe Wittgenstein is right that in Aristotelian terms, there may be formal and final causes in the absence of efficient and material ones. Perhaps there can be, but one cannot help wondering whether Wittgenstein may here be adopting towards contemporary neuroscientists the attitude that Renaissance Aristotelians adopted to Galileo, unquote. There is indeed no disputing that paradigmatic natural sciences, such as physics and chemistry, have advanced as a result of searching for structures that underlie powers of things and stuffs in nature. This is true of some parts of some sciences. It is not true of Newtonian physics, for example, nor is it true of relativity theory. Wittgenstein, however, avers the plausibility of the idea that there is no process in the brain that is correlated with associating or thinking. If so, then to be sure it will not be possible to read off one's spoken or written thoughts from neural cortical events. There will be no neural representation of the thoughts one expresses. Is Wittgenstein denying a vehicle for individual thoughts expressed? The question's puzzling, since it's powers, some powers, that are said to have vehicles. The power-vehicle relation is generic. Same power, same vehicle. Alcohol, quite generally, is the vehicle of the intoxicative power of whiskey. So is one to suppose that whenever anyone exercises the power of thinking, whenever anyone expresses the thought that such and such, there is an identical neural substrate or vehicle in their brain? This has no plausibility whatsoever, given the differences between the brains of different individuals at the micro level of neurons, synapses, and dendrites. Is one to suppose that whenever a given human being exercises power of thinking and expresses the specific thought that, say, Jack was wise to emigrate, in speech or writing, the very same neural structure is the vehicle? Even if the reiteration of the thought is separated by 20 years from its original expression? Given the dynamic character of the brain, this too seems anything but plausible. An alternative to the generic relation between power and vehicle is the idea that there can be no psychological event without a correlated physical neural cortical event. It might be thought that any psychological event must be supervenient on a cortical change. Hence, too, any individual expression of thought, such as my assertion that P, must be supervenient on a neural event. This, to be sure, is a much weaker position than the previous one. It is not committed to a generic representation, but only to a singular, so-called token correlation. But this is no longer a verifiable empirical hypothesis, since billions of neural events are doubtless occurring in a human being's brain when on some specific occasion he expresses his thought that P. Which one of these is supposed to be correlated with the agent's thinking that P? How might this be established? What is to count as a token correlation? Or is the claim that the psychological event is identical with some physical neural event? But this is surely to move from the unverifiable to the unintelligible. I might pause here and explain why it's unintelligible. Event identity, if event E is identical with E1 is identical with E2, well, one criterion of event identity requires the identity of the substance undergoing the change. But the change that's going on in the brain is a change to the brain, and the change involved in the human being who's speaking and expressing the thought, or merely thinking the thought, is a human being, and human beings aren't brains. So you don't have a case of brain identity, of event identity. That was what I'm alluding to. Now, I won't discuss this here, as this philosophical theory, broadly Davidsonian, I suppose, was not Wittgenstein's concern in the passages we are examining. So, undismayed, we can now return to the careful examination of Wittgenstein's discussion. The first paragraph has interpretive difficulties. The analogy with the seeds of the plant is unclear. Does Wittgenstein mean that in the case of plants, we should surely dismiss as preposterous the idea that nothing in the seed corresponds with the character of the plant which produced it, so that it's impossible to infer from the properties of the seed the features of the plant that will grow out from it, but that this stands in dramatic contrast to thinking and remembering. This might, at first glance, seem plausible, but that's not what Wittgenstein had in mind at all. The reflection on genetic causality antedates the discussion of psychophysical parallelism by a decade and was independent of any questions about it. It first occurs, as far as I know, in manuscript 199, written on the 26th of September 1937. And Wittgenstein wrote, and I quote from the manuscript, "Think of two different kinds of plant, A and B, both of which yield seeds. The seeds of both kinds look exactly the same, and even after most careful investigation, we can find no difference between them. But the seeds of an A plant always produce more A plants, and the seeds of a B plant, more B plants. In this situation, we can predict what sort of plant will grow out of such a seed only if we know which plant it has come from. Are we to be satisfied with this? Or should we say there must be a difference in the seeds themselves, otherwise they couldn't produce different plants? Their previous histories on their own can't cause their further development unless their histories have left traces in the seeds themselves. But now, what if we don't discover any difference between the seeds? And the fact is, it wasn't from the peculiarities of either seed that we made the prediction, but from its previous history. If I say history can't be the cause of the development, then this does not mean that I can't predict the development from the previous history, since that's just what I do. It means rather that we don't call that a causal connection, that this is not a case of predicting the effect from the cause. And to protest, there must be a difference in the seeds, even if we don't discover it, doesn't alter the facts. It only shows what a powerful urge we have to see everything in terms of cause and effect. A slightly different variation on the last sentence is, it only shows how powerful the cause-effect schema is in us. That's the end of the quotation. Wittgenstein's not denying the fruitfulness of the commitment of biological science in general, and of botany in particular, to the schema of cause and effect. What he's pointing out is that the must does not lie in nature, in the facts, but in our commitment to a particular form of explanation, namely an explanation in terms of efficient causality. To be sure, a farmer predicts what plants his seeds will yield from the history of the seeds, their last year's crops. But that is not what we call a causal explanation. We insist that there must be a structural genetic explanation for why these seeds produce this plant and those seeds produce that plant. But the must shows something about us, not about the facts discovered. It is, Wittgenstein insists, perfectly intelligible for prediction to be divorced from causal determination. For the terminal state, the production of the plant of the specified type need not be derivable from any intervening structure. That's perfectly intelligible. Now, this analysis is confirmed by other notes from manuscript 159, written in English, that are printed as Appendix A to what is now called Cause and Effect Intuitive Awareness. They seem to be notes for lectures given in spring 1938. It opens with a little dialogue. I know what this seed will give. It will give a poppy. Why? Because it came from a poppy. To say it will give a poppy because it came from a poppy would be disagreeable. Whereas I know it will because it came from a poppy is not so. There is something like action at a distance here which shocks people. the idea would revolutionize science. A seed that has come from a poppy will produce a poppy, that's all right, but not it will produce a poppy because it came from a poppy. Today, in case we actually discovered two seeds which we could not distinguish, but one producing a poppy and the other a rose, we should look frantically for a difference. But in other circumstances, we might give this up, give up looking for a difference. This would be a tremendous thing to do, as great as recognizing indeterminacy. We would no longer look for the difference, and so we would no longer say there must be a difference. Now, today, we have every reason to say that there must be a difference, but we could imagine circumstances where we would break with this tradition, unquote. This, I think, is a remarkable anticipation of neural network theory. And this, incidentally, has been powerfully argued for by Professor Natshev at University College London to occur in neural networks generating the same output from the same input. Now, how does all this bear upon psychophysical parallelism? When I talk or write, thereby articulating or expressing thoughts, I move my larynx, mouth, lips, perhaps gesture with my hands, and so forth. Or I move my hand and fingers in order to write. So a system of neural impulses is sent from my brain, say from the premotor and motor cortex. These impulses are indeed correlated with my spoken or written thoughts. That is, different words uttered or written would need different streams of impulses producing different movements. This Wittgenstein considers to be uncontroversial. But now, should the system not continue further in the direction of the center, for example, in the direction of the prefrontal cortices? Is not the genesis of the thought in question to be found in specific activity of the so-called cogitative centers of the brain? Must the thought expressed not have arisen in highly specific neural activity in the cortex, such that one could read off the thought from it? So every thought must have a neural representation. There is no must about it. There is nothing incoherent in the supposition that the specific thought uttered or inscribed have no determinate neural cause of which one can read it. So the idea of psychophysical parallelism is unjustified. Why should the order, the coherence and cogency of the verbal expression of the thoughts not proceed, so to speak, out of chaos? That is, out of neural dynamics that are so unpredictable as to appear random, of which the thought cannot be read. In another passage written a little later, on the 16th of December in 1948, Wittgenstein not only reaffirmed his view, but also expressed confidence that this view would, in the fullness of time, become accepted. Quote, "Indeed, I confess, nothing seems more possible to me than that people someday will come to the definite view that there is no copy in either the physiological or the nervous system which corresponds to a particular thought, a particular idea, a memory." Unquote. Wittgenstein's view can be supported by the following reflections. There is no reason for supposing that there is, let alone that there must be, a systematic structure or process of which it's possible to read the thoughts uttered or inscribed when someone says or writes what he thinks. To understand why I said or wrote 1314, one needs to know the context and history of my utterance or writing. I may have been asked for Jack's telephone number, or asked for the date of the Battle of Bannockburn, or asked for the date of the Battle of Agincourt and mistakenly written this answer. or asked to write the next two numbers after 12, or asked for the time of the next train to London, and so on and so forth. No neural story can supply the answer to the question of why I thought 1314. Hence, section 609, maybe certain psychological phenomena cannot be investigated physiologically because nothing physiological corresponds to them. Section 610 moves from thinking and giving verbal or written expression to a specific thought to recognition and remembering. Trace theory provides a familiar, concrete example to strengthen Wittgenstein's case. He was familiar with James's advocacy of trace theory and with the Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Köhler's. Early in TS 229, which is now Remarks on Philosophy of Psychology, Volume 1, Section 220, he had already touched on the matter. I quote, "An event leaves a trace in the memory. One sometimes imagines this as consisting in the events having left a trace, an impression, a consequence in the nervous system, as if one could say even the nerves have a memory. But then when someone remembered an event, he'd have to infer it from this impression, this trace. Whatever the event does leave behind in the organism, it isn't the memory. The organism compared with a dictaphone spool. The impression, the trace, is the alteration in the spool that the voice leaves behind. Can one say that the dictaphone, the spool, is remembering what was spoken all over again when it reproduces what it recorded?" Unquote. To be sure, when the answering machine on a modern phone is recording, it's not committing anything to memory, and the alterations on its chip, like the alterations on the spool of the dictaphone, are not memories. Similarly, when the recordings are played, the machine is not remembering anything. The bearing of this on trace theories of memory is patent. James had written in 1890 that, I quote, "The retention of N, it will be observed, is no mysterious storing up of an idea in an unconscious state. It is not a fact of the mental order at all. It is a purely physical phenomenon, a morphological feature, the presence of these paths, namely, in the finest recesses of the brain's tissue. The recall or recollection, on the other hand, is a psychophysical phenomenon with both a bodily and a mental side. The bodily side is the functional excitation of the tracts and paths in question. The mental side is the conscious vision of the past occurrence and the belief that we experienced it before." Of course, trace theories of memory go back to a metaphor in Plato that was concretized by Aristotle in De Memoria. Aristotle, alas, held that the functional adequacy of memory traces depended on the condition of the tissue. If it's insufficiently firm, as in babies, or too dry, as in the senescent, no trace will be left. Not, incidentally, a million miles removed from current neuroscientific theory, just a difference in the jargon. So that was James. Interestingly, 57 years later, Wolfgang Köhler wrote in a similar vein, and I quote, "What does recognition mean? It means that a present fact, usually a perceptual one, makes contact with a corresponding one in memory, a trace, a contact which gives the present perception the character of being known or familiar. But memory contains a tremendous number of traces, all of them representations of previous experiences, which must have been established by the processes accompanying such earlier experiences. Now, why does the present perception make contact with the right earlier experience? This is an astonishing achievement. Nobody seems to doubt that the selection is brought about by the similarity of the present experience and the experience of the corresponding earlier fact. But since this earlier experience is not present at the time, we have to assume that the trace of the earlier experience resembles the present experience, and it is this similarity of our present experience or corresponding cortical process and that trace which makes the selection possible. Elsewhere he wrote, all sound theories of memory, of habit and so forth must contain hypotheses about memory traces as physiological facts. Such theories must also assume that the characteristics of traces are more or less akin to those of the processes by which they've been established. Otherwise, how could the accuracy of recall be explained? Unquote. With the passing of time and the enlargement of knowledge about brain functions, the tale became more complex. And I quote from Ian Glenn in 1999. Since the episodes that give rise to memories involve a variety of perceptions, it seems likely that the laying down of such memories involves nerve cells in the association areas and in secondary or higher cortical areas concerned with the different senses. It is also likely that recalling memories involves recreating something like the original pattern of activity in those same sets of cells, or at least some of them. Initially, then, both the hippocampus zone and the neocortical zone must act together. Eventually, when consolidation is complete, the memories are stored in such a fashion that they are available without involvement of the hippocampal zone, implying that storage is then wholly in the neocortical zone, unquote. I shall pause a moment to draw some important distinctions. It's noteworthy that there was extensive confusion about the use of the expression memory and its cognates. It was taken for granted by many neuroscientists that what is remembered, the object of memory, is past experience. But to remember learning something is altogether different from remembering what was learnt. Most of what we have learnt and remember does not involve recollecting the learning of it. What we remember need not be of the past at all, since we may remember what we have to do tomorrow or next week. We may remember general omnitemporal facts, such as are expressed by statements of laws of nature. We may remember atemporal data, such as the laws of logic and theorems of mathematics. That's the first distinction to bear in mind here. A related confusion is a consequence of failing to apprehend the multivalent character of the term memory and remember to mean, in one context, the actual recollection at a given time and place. In another, the power to recollect or bring something to mind. And in the third, to signify not the remembering, but what is remembered, as when we say, my memory is that it's at 3 p.m., or as far as I remember, it's at 3 p.m. Now, in any scientific discussion of memory, it must be determined which sense of memory is in play. That is, are we talking about the faculty? Are we talking about an exercise of the, are we talking about retention, or are we talking about the exercise of the faculty on a particular occasion? In more recent times, Eric Kandel was awarded the Nobel Prize for his path-breaking work on memory. He worked on the gill withdrawal reflex of aplasia, the sea slug, a primitive organism, the neurons of which are exceptionally large and hence relatively amenable to experiment. It should be noted in passing that a reflex is not memory involving at all. and the acceleration of a reflex in response to recurrent exposure to a stock stimulus is not an example of memory or recollection. Memory, rather crudely speaking for the moment, is retention of knowledge or information acquired in experience. For example, I know now because I learnt previously. This, however, was not how Candell saw matters. Together with his colleague Squire, he averred that, I quote, "Every sensible experience involves cortical changes. These cortical changes, once consolidated, imprinted, are stored memories. The consequent theories of memory explicitly insist that, quote, the resulting memories are stored as changes in strength at many synapses within a large ensemble of interconnected neurons," unquote. That's from Squire and Candell in 1999. This conception, which is susceptible to the challenge of Zettel 610, Wittgenstein's remark on memory traces, is defective for multiple reasons, of which I shall mention three. First, it confuses storage with retention. One can store information in a notebook, on a card index, in a filing cabinet, on a computer or recording device, by means of a photograph or a drawing. But there is no such thing as storing information in brains or synaptic connections. Stores of information contain information, but an agent that retains information possesses it. Human beings can retain information antecedently acquired. They learn things, that is, they acquire the abilities characteristic of knowing what was learnt, and do not forget what they learnt. So they can now act on what they learnt, reason from what they learnt to new conclusions. They experience things and can say what they experience. If they do not forget, then they retain the ability to act on what they experienced, that is, to act or refrain from action for the reason of such and such. Storage is irrelevant. What is necessary is the persistence of cognitive powers. Secondly, it fails to render intelligible the notion of storing experiences in memory traces. It is wholly opaque what is meant by storing an experience. One may experience various things, perceive perceptibilia, participate in various activities, acquire information by being taught, and one may learn how to do things. All this, and very much more, may be deemed to be experiences. It is, as Ryle might put it, a portmanteau word. However, the term experience is equivocal. It may signify the experiencing or what is experienced. Now, one can't store experiencing something. At most, one can store a description of the experiencing or capture the experience on film, which can be stored. Can one store what is experienced? The question is too general and nebulous, since the very term experiences is such a catch-all. Suppose one perceived something, and note that the objects of perception are indefinitely numerous in category and kind. Can one store what one experienced? A butterfly in flight, a noise, a sonata, a person, a landscape, a view? One can often remember what one experienced and recount it or call it to mind, act on the basis of it or dwell on it, like Wordsworth on daffodils or Tintern Abbey in fond recollection. But can one store it in memory traces? Thirdly, it conceives of the alleged memory traces stored in the brain in the form of changes in strength of synaptic connections as representations of what is remembered. But this is not intelligible. Whatever a memory trace may be, it can be neither semantic, a sentence stating what is remembered, nor iconic, a picture or image of what is remembered. For the brain contains neither sentences nor images, and changes in the strength of synaptic connections are not representations of anything. Might they then be simply causal correlates, instances of psychophysical parallelism? We've already shown this idea to be mistaken, since type-type correlation is empirically wildly implausible, and token-token correlation makes no sense, since there could be no such correlation. The assumption of the necessity of a causal chain between antecedent neural events coincident with information acquisition and current recollection is part and parcel of our preconceptions about psychophysical parallelism. It is, I think, logically flawed. One may know now something one experienced, became aware of, or came to know in the past. One may often be said to remember now the information one acquired in the past, which need not be about the past. One may be said to remember now because one acquired the information previously. But no trace need be invoked in order to render intelligible the retention of information acquired, that is, not having forgotten. Hence, Wittgenstein concludes, I quote again, the prejudice in favor of psychophysical parallelism is a fruit of primitive interpretations of our concepts. For if one grants causality between psychological phenomena, which is not mediated physiologically, one thinks one is professing belief in a gaseous mental entity. That's Tetel 611. There's an alternative in Remarks on Philosophy of Psychology, Volume 1906, which I'll read out too. The prejudice in favor of psychophysical parallelism is also a fruit of a primitive conception of grammar. For if one grants causality between psychological phenomena which is not mediated physiologically, one fancies that in so doing one is making an admission of the existence of a mind alongside the body, a ghostly mental being, unquote. Wittgenstein is not denying that a multitude of changes in the brain may occur when one experiences something that one subsequently remembers. Indeed, it may well be that but for these unknown transformations, we would not remember what we can and do remember. What he is denying is that these transformations are in any sense stored memories or representations. He clarifies his point with what I think is a felicitous example. Imagine the following phenomenon. If I want someone to take note of a text that I recite to him so that he can repeat it to me later, I have to give him pencil and paper. While I'm speaking, he makes lines, marks on the paper. If he has to reproduce the text later, he follows those marks with his eyes and recites the text. But I assume that what he's jotted down isn't writing. It's not connected by rules with the words of the text. Yet without these jottings, he's unable to reproduce the text. And if anything in it is altered, if part of it is destroyed, he gets stuck in his reading or recites the text uncertainly or carelessly, or cannot find the words at all. This can be imagined. What I called jottings would not be a rendering of the text, not a translation, so to speak, in another symbolism. The text would not be stored up in the jottings. And why should it be stored up in our nervous system? Unquote. Wittgenstein concludes this sequence of remarks with an observation that is of the greatest significance. Why should not the initial and terminal states of a system be connected by a natural law which does not cover the intermediate state? Only don't think of causal efficacy, don't think of causal agency. Now, what he's envisaging is a regular connection. He calls it here a natural law, meaning a natural as opposed to a normative regularity, a natural regularity as opposed to a normative regularity. So what he's envisaging is a regular connection between input hearing the text and output repeating the text without any causal links, representation, that could be said to determine the output. As I mentioned before, it's been argued by Professor Nachev at Queen's Square Neurology Centre at University College London that this is precisely what is exemplified by artificial neural networks, the theory of which was in effect anticipated by Wittgenstein here. If that is so, it's a rather interesting case of functionally convergent evolution, so to speak, the evolution of the brain on the one side and of machine learning on the other. Be that as it may, it seems that there is no reason to suppose that the connection between a past experience and a present recollection of a past experience, or of information gained or retained from that experience, is mediated by an internal cortical representation. Indeed, there is every reason to suppose that this is a conceptual confusion. For what is recollected is the past experience or information gleaned from such an experience. What I remember is, say, my breaking my ankle, or sitting my examinations, or your winning the race, his death or her wedding, not some facsimile thereof. When I remember Jack and Jill, it's Jack and Jill themselves that I remember, not a representation of them, which is the case if I remember a portrait of them, because a portrait is a representation. The connection is logical. It's a case of identity, not of causality. It requires no causal intermediary. Indeed, a causal intermediary is to be sought precisely in those cases when one does not actually remember, but only seems to remember because, for example, one has been recurrently told of the past experience innumerable times, say, by one's parents. These recurrent narrations of the past are indeed causal intermediaries that are absent in cases in which one does remember. That last thought is derived from my dear late friend, Bede Rundle. Thank you very much.